were installed and working in commercial enterprises. These first engines were used to power pumps and produced only reciprocating motion to move the pump rods at the bottom of the shaft. The design was commercially successful, and for the next 5 years, Watt was very busy installing more engines, mostly in Cornwall, for pumping water out of mines. These early engines were not manufactured by Boulton and Watt but were made by others according to drawings made by Watt, who served in the role of consulting engineer. The erection of the engine and its shakedown was supervised by Watt, at first, and then by men in the firm's employ. These were large machines. The first, for example, had a cylinder with a diameter of some 50 inches and an overall height of about 24 feet, and required the construction of a dedicated building to house it. Boulton and Watt charged an annual payment, equal to 1/3 of the value of the coal saved in comparison to a new common engine performing the same work. The field of application for the invention was greatly widened when Boulton urged Watt to convert the reciprocating motion of the piston to produce rotational power for grinding, weaving and milling. Although for crank seemed the obvious solution to the conversion, Watt and Boulton were stymied by a patent for this whose holder, James Pickard and his associates, proposed to cross-license the external condenser. Watt adamantly opposed this, and they circumvented the patent by their Sun and Planet gear in 1781. Over the next 6 years, he made a number of other improvements and modifications to the steam engine. A double-acting engine, in which the steam acted alternately on both sides of the piston, was one. He described methods for working the steam expansively, i.e., using steam at pressures well above the atmospheric. A compound engine, which connected 2 or more engines, was described. 2 more patents were granted for these in 1781 and 1782. Numerous other improvements that made for easier manufacture and installation were continually implemented. One of these included the use of the steam indicator, which produced an informative plot of the pressure in the cylinder against its volume, which he kept as a trader's grit. Another important invention, one which Watt was most proud of, was the parallel motion linkage, which was essential in double-acting engines as it produced the straight-line motion required for the cylinder rod and pump, from the connected rocking beam, whose end moves in a circular arc. This was patented in 1784. A throttle valve to control the power of the engine, and a centrifugal governor, patented in 1788, 29, to keep it from running away, were very important. These improvements taken together produced an engine which was up to 5 times as fuel efficient as the new common engine. Because of the danger of exploding boilers, which were in a very primitive stage of development, and the ongoing issues with leaks, Watt restricted his use of high-pressure steam. All of his engines used steam at near atmospheric pressure. Patent trials. A steam engine built to James Watt's patent in 1848 at Freiburg in Germany. Edward Bull started constructing engines for Boulton and Watt in Cornwall in 1781. By 1792, he had started making engines of his own design, but which contained a separate condenser, and so infringed Watt's patents. 2 brothers, Jabez Carter Hornblower and Jonathan Hornblower Jr., also started to build engines about the same time. Others began to modify new common engines within a condenser, and the mine owners in Cornwall became convinced that Watt's patent could not be enforced. They started to withhold payments to Boulton and Watt, which by 1795 had fallen in hard times. Of the total £21,000, equivalent to £2,310,000 as of 2021, owed, only £2,500 had been received. Watt was forced to go to court to enforce his claims. 30. He first sued Bull in 1793. The jury found for what, but the question of whether or not the original specification of the patent was valid was left to another trial. In the meantime, injunctions were issued against the infringers, forcing their payments of the royalties to be placed in escrow. The trial on determining the validity of the specifications, which was held in the following, was inconclusive, but the injunctions remained in force, and the infringers, except for Jonathan Hornblower, all began to settle their cases. Hornblower was soon brought to trial in 1799, and the verdict of the four was decisively in favor of Watt. Their friend John Wilkinson, who had solved the problem of boring an accurate cylinder, was a particularly grievous case. He had erected about 20 engines without Boulton's and Watt's knowledge. They finally agreed to settle the infringement in 1796.31. Boulton and Watt never collected all that was owed them, but the disputes were all settled directly between the parties or through arbitration. These trials were extremely costly in both money and time, but ultimately were successful for the firm. Copying machine. Portable copying machine by James Watt and Company circa 1795 before 1780. There was no good method for making copies of letters or drawings. The only method sometimes used was a mechanical one using multiple linked pens. Watt at first experimented with improving this method, but soon gave up on Thi's approach because it was so cumbersome. He instead decided to physically transfer some ink from the front of the original to the back of another sheet, moistened with a solvent, and pressed to the original. The second sheet had to be thin, so that the ink could be seen through it when the copy was held up to the light, thus reproducing the original exactly. 32-33. Watt started to develop the process in 1779, and made many experiments to formulate the ink, select the thin paper, to devise a method for wetting the special thin paper, and to make a press suitable for applying the correct pressure to effect the transfer. All of these required much experimentation, but he soon had enough success to patent the process a year later. Watt formed another partnership with Boulton, who provided financing, and James Gear, to manage the business, in a firm called James Watt and Company. The perfection of the invention required much more development work before it could be routinely used by others, but this was carried out over the next few years. Boulton and Watt gave up their shares to their sons in 1794.34. It became a commercial success and was widely used in offices even into the 20th century. Chemical experiments. From an early age, Watt was very interested in chemistry. In late 1786, while in Paris, he witnessed an experiment by Claude Louis Berthollet in which he reacted hydrochloric acid with manganese dioxide to produce chlorine. He had already found that an aqueous solution of chlorine could bleach textiles, and had published his findings, which aroused great interest among many potential rivals. When Watt returned to Britain, he began experiments along these lines with hopes of finding a commercially viable process. He discovered that a mixture of salt, manganese dioxide and sulfuric acid could produce chlorine, which Watt believed might be a cheaper method. He passed the chlorine into a weak solution of alkali, and obtained a turbid solution that appeared to have good bleaching properties. He soon communicated these results to James MacGregor, his father-in-law, who was a bleacher in Glasgow. Otherwise, he tried to keep his method a secret. 35. With MacGregor and his wife Annie, he started to scale up the process, and in March 1788, MacGregor was able to bleach 1,500 yards, 4,500 feet, of cloth to his satisfaction. About this time, Berthollet discovered the salt and sulfuric acid process, and published it, so it became public knowledge. Many others began to experiment with improving the process, which still had many shortcomings, not the least of which was the problem of transporting the liquid product. Watt's rivals soon overtook him in developing the process, and he dropped out of the race. It was not until 1799, when Charles Tennant patented a process for producing solid bleaching powder, calcium hypochlorite, that it became a commercial success. By 1794, Watt had been chosen by Thomas Beddoes to manufacture apparatuses to produce, clean and store gases for use in the new pneumatic institution at Hotwells in Bristol. Watt continued to experiment with various gases for several years, but by 1797, the medical uses for the factitious as artificial gases had come to a dead end. 36. Personality. Scientific apparatus designed by Boulton and Watt in preparation of pneumatic institution in Bristol. Watt combined theoretical knowledge of science with the ability to apply it practically. Chemist Humphrey Davy said of him, "Those who consider James Watt only as a great practical mechanic form a very erroneous idea of his character. He was equally distinguished as a natural philosopher and a chemist, and his inventions demonstrate his profound knowledge of those sciences, and the peculiar characteristic of genius, the union of them for practical application." 37. He was greatly respected by other prominent men of the Industrial Revolution. 38. He was an important member of the Lunar Society of Birmingham, and was a much sought-after conversationalist and companion, always interested in expanding his horizons. 39. His personal relationships with his friends and business partners were always congenial and long-lasting. According to Lord Liverpool, Prime Minister of the UK, 40, a more excellent and amicable man in all the relations of life I believe never existed. Watt was a prolific correspondent. During his years in Cornwall, he wrote long letters to Boulton several times per week. He was averse to publishing his results in, for example, the Philosophical Transactions of Royal Society, however, and instead preferred to communicate his ideas in patents. 41. He was an excellent draftsman. James Watt's letters from the Science Museum Library and Archives in Writton, near Swindon. He was a rather poor businessman, and especially hated bargaining and negotiating terms with those who sought to use the steam engine. In a letter to William Small in 1772, Watt confessed that he would rather face a loaded cannon than settle an account or make a bargain. 42. Until he retired, he was always very concerned about his financial affairs, and was something of a worrier. His health was often poor and he suffered frequent nervous headaches and depression. When he retired in 1800, he became a rich enough man to pass the business on to his sons. Soho Foundry. At first, the partnership made the drawings and specifications for engines, and supervised the work to erect them on the customer's property. They produced almost none of the parts themselves. Watt did most of his work at Hisham in Harper's Hill in Birmingham, while Boulton worked at the Soho manufactory. Gradually, the partners began to actually manufacture more and more of the parts, and by 1795, they purchased a property about a mile away from the Soho manufactory, on the banks of the Birmingham Canal, to establish a new foundry for the manufacture of the engines. The Soho foundry formally opened in 1796 at a time when Watt's sons, Gregory and James Jr. were heavily involved in the management of the enterprise. In 1800, the year of Watt's retirement, the firm made a total of 41 engines. 43, later years. An 1835 painting of Heathfield Watt's house in Handsworth, by Alan Edward Everett James Watt's workshop. Watt retired in 1800, the same year that his fundamental patent and partnership with Boulton expired. The famous partnership was transferred to the men's sons, Matthew Robinson Boulton and James Watt Jr. Longtime firm engineer William Murdoch was soon made a partner and the firm prospered. Watt continued to invent other things before and during his semi-retirement. Within his home in Handsworth, Staffordshire, Watt made use of a garret room as a workshop, and it was here that he worked on many of his inventions. 44. Among other things, he invented and constructed several machines for copying sculptures and medallions which worked very well, but which he never patented. 45. One of the first sculptures he produced with the machine was a small head of his old professor friend Adam Smith. He maintained his interest in civil engineering and was a consultant on several significant projects. He proposed, for example, a method for constructing a flexible pipe to be used for pumping water under the River Clyde at Glasgow. 46. He and his second wife travelled to France and Germany, and he purchased an estate in Mid Wales at Dodowlod House, 1 mile south of Llanwrthal, which he much improved. In 1816, he took a trip on the paddle steamer Comet, a product of his inventions, to revisit his hometown off Greenock. 47. He died on the 25th of August 1819 at his home Heathfield Hall near Handsworth in Staffordshire, now part of Birmingham, at the age of 83. He was buried on the 2nd of September in the graveyard of St. Mary's Church, Handsworth. The church has since been extended and his grave is now inside the church. Family. On the 16th of July 1764, Watt married his cousin Margaret Miller, d. 1773. They had 2 children, Margaret, 1767-1796, and James, 1769-1848. In 1791, their daughter married James Miller. In September 1773, while Watt was working in the Scottish Highlands, he learned that his wife, who was pregnant with their 3rd child, was seriously ill. He immediately returned home but found that she had died and their child was stillborn. 48. In 1775, he married Anne MacGregor, d. 1832. 48. Freemasonry. He was initiated into Scottish Freemasonry in the Glasgow Royal Arch Lodge, No. 77, in 1763. The lodge ceased to exist in 1810. A Masonic lodge was named after him in his hometown of Glasgow, Lodge James Watt, No. 1215. 49. Murdoch's contributions. William Murdoch joined Boulton and Watt in 1777. At first, he worked in the pattern shop in Soho, but soon he was erecting engines in Cornwall. He became an important part of the firm and made many contributions to its success. A very able man, he made several important inventions on his own. John Griffiths, who wrote a biography, 50, of him in 1992, has argued that Watt's discouragement of Murdoch's work with high-pressure steam on his steam road locomotive experiments delayed its development. Watt rightly believed that boilers of the time would be unsafe at higher pressures. 51. Watt patented the application of the sun and planet gear to steam in 1781 and a steam locomotive in 1784, both of which have strong claims to have been invented by Murdoch. 52. The patent was never contested by Murdoch, however, and Boulton and Watt's firm continued to use the sun and planet gear in their rotative engines, even long after the patent for the crank expired in 1794. Murdoch was made a partner of firm in 1810, where he remained until his retirement 20 years later at the age of 76. Legacy. A preserved Watt beam engine at Loughborough University. As one author states, James Watt's improvements to the steam engine converted it from a prime mover of marginal efficiency into the mechanical workhorse of the Industrial Revolution. 53. Honours. Watt was much honoured in his own time. In 1784, He was made a Fellow of the Royal Society of Edinburgh, and was elected as a member of the Batavian Society for Experimental Philosophy, of Rotterdam, the Netherlands, in 1787. In 1789